Caroline Mercer did not wait for Eleanor Whitaker to set down her trunk. She walked straight into the middle of the street, positioned herself between Eleanor and the schoolhouse door, and said it loud enough for everyone gathered on the boardwalk to hear. "We don't take charity cases in Raven Creek, and we certainly don't let them teach our children." Eleanor stood in the dust with her travel bag cutting into her shoulder and a leather satchel of books pressed against her ribs. She had been in this town for exactly 4 minutes. The crowd went quiet the way crowds do when they want to watch something without appearing to enjoy it. If that happened to you, if someone stripped away everything you'd worked for, in public, before you'd spoken a single word, what would you do? This is Eleanor's story, and it is not a comfortable one. Before we go further, if stories about people who refuse to disappear move something in you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Eleanor Whitaker arrived in Raven Creek, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind carried grit that found its way into the corners of your eyes before you'd taken 3 steps off the stage. She had been riding since before dawn, wedged between a traveling salesman who smelled of camphor oil and a young couple who slept against each other in a way that made her feel the particular loneliness of women who travel alone. She didn't mind the loneliness exactly. She had made her peace with it the way a person learns to sleep on a mattress that lists to one side. You adjust, you find the position that hurts least, and eventually you stop noticing. She had the letter folded inside her coat pocket. She had read it so many times the paper had softened along the creases. Dear Miss Whitaker, the Raven Creek School Board is pleased to offer you the position of school teacher, beginning the 1st of September. She had the signature of the board chairman, a man named Gerald Pratt, at the bottom. She had her credentials from the normal school in Ohio. She had 6 years of teaching experience in 2 different counties, and she had references from 3 separate principals, all of them men, all of them straightforward in their praise. She was not arriving in Raven Creek as a gamble. She was arriving as someone who had been hired, evaluated, and found sufficient. None of that was visible from the outside. What was visible from the outside was what had always preceded Eleanor into every room she'd ever entered. She was a large woman, heavy through the shoulders and hips, broad-faced, with hands that looked more like a farmer's than a school teacher's. She moved carefully, the way people move when they've spent years navigating spaces that weren't built with them in mind. Not slowly, carefully. There was a difference, though most people never noticed it. The stage stopped in front of Morrow's General Store, and Eleanor was the last one off. She handed her trunk down herself rather than wait for the driver's grudging assistance, and she stood in the street with it at her feet and looked at the town she'd agreed to spend the next year of her life in. Raven Creek was not much to look at. A main street with buildings pressed together like books on a shelf with no bookends. A feed store, a post office, a land office with peeling paint on the sign, a saloon that was already doing business despite the early hour, and at the far end of the street, set slightly apart from everything else, a low wooden building with a bell mounted above the door. The schoolhouse. She recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something you've been imagining for weeks. She was reaching for the handle of her trunk when she heard the footsteps. Caroline Mercer walked like a woman who had decided long ago that the world owed her right of way. She was dressed well, not extravagantly, but with the particular precision of someone who considered appearance to be a form of argument. Her hair was coiled and pinned without a strand out of place. She was perhaps 50, with a face that might have been handsome once and had settled instead into something harder and more certain of itself. She stopped in the middle of the street, not beside Eleanor, in front of her. "You're the new teacher," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Whitaker. I have a letter from Chairman Pratt confirming my—" "I can see what you are." Caroline Mercer said it plainly, without heat, which made it worse than if she'd shouted it. She looked Eleanor over the way a person looks at livestock they are not considering purchasing. "I'm Caroline Mercer. I serve on the school board, and I have to tell you, Miss Whitaker, that there has been a misunderstanding." Eleanor kept her hand on her trunk. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "The kind where someone in a hurry makes an offer without consulting the full board." Caroline glanced toward the boardwalk, and Eleanor followed her eyes. There were people watching. A woman in an apron outside the dry goods store. 2 men by the feed store who had stopped pretending to work. a cluster of older women near the post office who were not pretending at all. Gerald Pratt has a generous heart, but he sometimes acts before he thinks. The position here requires someone who can, she paused, as if selecting the word with care, represent the community appropriately. I have a signed offer of employment, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She had worked to make it steady. I don't doubt that. Caroline's gaze moved over Eleanor again, and it settled finally in a way that was unmistakable. Not on Eleanor's face, not on her credentials. But Raven Creek has standards. Our children look to their teacher as an example of discipline, self-governance. She let the pause do the work she was too careful to do herself. You understand what I'm saying, I trust. Eleanor understood exactly what she was saying. She had understood it since she was 9 years old, and a teacher back in Ohio had seated her in the back of the classroom because, as that teacher put it, she took up too much space. She had understood it at 16 when a boy she liked had told her in front of his friends that she'd be pretty if she weren't so, and then laughed when she flushed. She had understood it every time she walked into a room and felt the temperature of other people's assumptions drop around her like a cold front. She was fluent in this language. She had never chosen to speak it. I understand, Eleanor said, that I have a valid offer of employment and that the schoolhouse is at the end of this street and that I intend to walk to it. Caroline Mercer's expression did not change. There will be a board meeting. There can be as many board meetings as you like, Eleanor said, after I've seen the classroom. She picked up her trunk. It was heavy, 40 pounds at least, full of books and lesson materials, and she would not ask anyone to help her with it. Not now. She walked past Caroline Mercer without looking at her again, and she felt the weight of every set of eyes on the boardwalk tracking her progress, and she kept her chin level and her pace even, and she did not let any of it show on her face. She was very good at not letting things show on her face. She had been practicing for 34 years. The schoolhouse was unlocked, which surprised her. She had expected to find a padlock and a long wait. Instead, the door swung inward on a hinge that needed oil, and she stepped into a single room that smelled of dust and old chalk and the particular staleness of a space that hadn't been used in some time. There were 8 wooden desks arranged in 2 rows, a chalkboard at the front with the ghost of someone else's lessons still faintly visible on its surface, a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a row of wooden pegs along one wall where coats were meant to hang. Eleanor set her trunk down and stood in the center of the room. It was not a beautiful room. The floorboards were uneven, and 2 of the desks had legs that didn't quite match. The window glass was wavy in the way old glass gets, so the view of the street outside was slightly distorted, like looking at the world through water. But there was enough light, and the stove looked functional, and the chalkboard was salvageable. She had taught in worse. She opened her trunk and began taking out her books. This was what she always did first, in any new classroom. Not arrange the desks, not inspect the stove, not take stock of the supplies. She put the books out first because a room with books in it was already a different kind of room. She lined them along the windowsill, a reader, an arithmetic primer, a grammar text, a collection of American history that she'd bought with her own money in Columbus because the school board in her last position had not seen fit to provide one, and a large illustrated natural history that she'd been carrying around since her first teaching post, because children opened it and forgot for a few minutes to be afraid of being wrong. She was arranging the last of them when she heard footsteps on the boards outside. She turned, expecting Caroline Mercer with reinforcements. It was not Caroline Mercer. The man who appeared in the doorway was perhaps 40, maybe a year or 2 either side of it, with a build that came from physical work rather than intention, wide through the chest, with forearms that spoke of the kind of labor that doesn't apologize for itself. He had a burn scar along the inside of his left wrist, the faded kind that had been there long enough to become part of him. His face was weathered and not unpleasant, and he held his hat in his hands with the instinctive courtesy of a man who'd been raised to remove it when he entered a building, even when the building was only a one-room schoolhouse. He looked at Eleanor and then at the books on the windowsill and then back at Eleanor. "You're the teacher," he said. "So I've been told," Eleanor said. "Twice today, with rather different tones." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "I heard what Caroline said to you in the street." "Most of the town heard what Caroline said to me in the street." "Yeah." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'm Caleb Warren. I run the blacksmith shop 2 doors down from the feed store. Eleanor Whitaker. He nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already figured out. I have 2 children. Thomas, he's 11, and Rose, she just turned 8. He stopped. I've been trying to find someone to teach them for 8 months. The last teacher we had left after 4 weeks. Before that, it was a young fellow straight out of school who lasted about 6 weeks before deciding frontier life wasn't for him. I see, Eleanor said. I don't know what your qualifications are, Caleb said, and I don't especially care what Caroline Mercer thinks about how you look. What I want to know is, he paused, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was not quite desperation, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has been managing without something important for too long. Can you teach my children? Eleanor looked at him. She had been looked at in many ways over the years, with mockery, with pity, with the particular cruelty of people who didn't consider it cruelty. This man was looking at her the way a person looks at someone they are actually asking a question of, which was rarer than it should have been. Yes, she said. I can teach your children. The board meeting happened 3 days later, and it went about the way Eleanor had expected. There were 5 members, including Caroline Mercer and Gerald Pratt, the chairman who had sent her the offer letter. Pratt was a thin man with spectacles and the slightly hunted expression of someone who had recently discovered that a decision he felt good about had made him unpopular. The other 3 members were men she had not yet met, a rancher named Hollis, a man who owned the land office named Dutton, and a minister named Garrett who said almost nothing and looked at the ceiling whenever the conversation became uncomfortable. They met in the back room of the land office, around a table that was too large for the space, and Eleanor sat at one end of it with her credentials laid out in front of her like cards, in a hand she was being forced to play before she'd properly sorted them. Caroline led the meeting. She was efficient about it, Eleanor would give her that. She didn't meander. She presented her objections with the organization of someone who had prepared the night before, which Eleanor suspected she had. The position of school teacher is not merely an instructional role, Caroline said. It is a representational one. Our teacher is the first model of discipline and self-governance our children encounter outside the home. She must present herself accordingly. She did not look at Eleanor when she said this. She was addressing the men at the table. I have spoken with several parents in town, and there is significant concern about whether Miss Whitaker is suited to that representational role. She has 6 years of experience, Gerald Pratt said, with the determined mildness of a man who knew he was losing ground. Experience is one consideration. Caroline set her hands flat on the table. Character is another. I would like to speak, Eleanor said. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when someone says a thing that is obvious but that no one has quite expected. Caroline looked at her for the first time since the meeting started. Of course. Eleanor had prepared remarks. She had them written out on a folded piece of paper in her pocket because she had learned over years that when she was angry her voice could become unsteady, and she could not afford an unsteady voice tonight. She took the paper out and set it on the table, and then she didn't look at it. I was hired based on my qualifications, she said. Those qualifications are documented and verifiable. I have letters from 3 principals and a certification from the Ohio Normal School. In the 3 days since I arrived, I have met with 4 families in this town and assessed the learning needs of 7 children. 2 of them are significantly behind where they should be for their ages, not because they lack ability, but because they've had inconsistent instruction. One of them hasn't had any formal schooling in over a year. She paused. She looked at Caroline Mercer. I understand what objection is actually being raised here, Eleanor said. And I want to say, plainly, that I have been teaching for 6 years, and in those 6 years I have not once had a child fail to learn because of how I looked. I have had children fail to learn because of poverty and illness, and parents who didn't value education, and because the world is genuinely hard and learning is genuinely difficult. Not because their teacher was too large. She picked up her certification and held it across the table to Pratt, who took it with both hands. I am not asking you to like me. I am asking you to honor the agreement you made. The silence afterward was the kind that means different things to different people in the room. Hollis cleared his throat. Dutton studied the table. Garrett continued his examination of the ceiling. Gerald Pratt set the certification down in front of him and pressed both palms against it. I think Miss Whitaker makes a fair point, he said. Caroline Mercer turned to look at him. The look was brief and very precise, the look of a woman filing information for later use. "The matter will be put to a vote," she said, "and I'll remind the board that the parents of this community have made their concerns known." The vote was 3-2 to allow Eleanor to continue, with Caroline and Hollis in opposition. Eleanor thanked the board, gathered her credentials, and left the room. She stood outside the land office in the dark street and exhaled. She had won, technically. She had won by a margin of 1 vote, in a room where 2 of the 5 people present considered her an embarrassment to the town, and 3 had voted to retain her because it was the procedurally correct thing to do, rather than because any of them had particularly wanted her there. She was not sure what to do with that kind of victory. She was still standing there when she heard boots on the boardwalk and turned to find Caleb Warren. He stopped a few feet away with his hat in his hands again and said, "I was waiting to see how it came out." 3-2, she said. "Better than I thought it would be, honestly." He was quiet a moment. "Caroline had the votes lined up this time last week. Changed after you met with those families." Eleanor looked at him. "You knew about the meeting before tonight?" Raven Creek's not a big town. He shrugged, the way men do when they want to present a thing as smaller than it is. "I might have stopped in on Dutton this morning." She stared at him. "You spoke to him on my behalf?" "I told him you'd spent 2 hours with the Morrison children and that their mother cried because Daniel read something aloud for the first time." He put his hat back on. "I told him what I saw, that's all." Eleanor opened her mouth and closed it again. She had been advocated for by supervisors, by principals, by colleagues, always in institutional terms, in the careful language of professional evaluation. She had never been advocated for in the simple human terms of, "I saw what she did, and I want you to know it." She didn't quite know what to do with that either. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Caleb said. "Caroline's not done." I was right, of course. Eleanor opened the schoolhouse the following Monday to find that the 2 boys she'd been expecting, the Hollis boys, sons of the rancher who had voted against her, were not there. Their mother, a small tense woman named Ada, appeared at the schoolhouse door mid-morning and told Eleanor, without quite meeting her eyes, that she'd be keeping the boys home for the present. Her husband had decided they could learn their letters from her. "They're behind," Eleanor said. "Your older boy especially. He's 12 and he's still struggling with—" "We'll manage," Ada said, and walked away. The schoolhouse had 8 desks, and by the end of the first week, Eleanor had 5 students. It wasn't nothing. She had worked with less. But the empty desks were visible, and in a town this small, visible things had weight. Thomas Warren sat in the second desk on the left. He was a boy who took up space in the particular way of children who've learned that taking up space is safer than being invisible, loud when he was comfortable, completely still when he wasn't. He had dark eyes, and his father's wide hands, and a habit of picking at the edge of his desk when something asked of him wasn't immediately going his way. He was bright. Eleanor could see it clearly within the first hour, the kind of intelligence that hadn't yet learned it was allowed to be intelligence, that was still camouflaging itself as indifference. He could not read. Not couldn't in the permanent sense. He could decode individual letters, could sound out short, simple words with effort, but anything longer than a single syllable caused him to shut down in a way that was very specific and very familiar to Eleanor. She had seen it before. It wasn't laziness, and it wasn't lack of intelligence. It was the particular shame of a child who has tried and failed in front of other people enough times that trying itself has become dangerous. She didn't push him on the first day. She didn't single him out. She taught to the group and she kept her attention moving, and she asked Thomas about things she already suspected he knew the answer to. The names of the tools his father used, the difference between wrought iron and cast iron, which he explained with surprising technical precision for an 11-year-old. And she watched his posture loosen incrementally through the morning until by the time she dismissed them for the noon break, he was sitting like a boy instead of a board. Rose was different. Rose Warren sat in the back row and watched everything and said nothing. She was small for 8, with her father's coloring but arranged more delicately, and she had the particular stillness of children who have learned that drawing attention can lead to loss. She answered when Eleanor addressed her directly, in a voice barely above a whisper, and she did her work with a neatness that seemed less like pride than like self-protection, as if perfection in small things was the one thing that couldn't be taken from her. Eleanor learned from Caleb, that first week, that the children's mother had died 2 years earlier. Fever, quick and without much warning, the way frontier deaths often happened. There had been a morning where she was fine, and an evening where she wasn't, and a week later she was gone. Rose stopped talking for a while, Caleb said. He said it the way people say things they've carried so long they've worn smooth. She talks now, but not a lot. Not with people she doesn't know. She watches everything, Eleanor said. Yeah. He was quiet a beat. She's been watching you. Eleanor thought about that on her walk back to the boarding house where she had a small room. The cheapest room, at the back, which was fine because she was used to small rooms and didn't need much. She thought about what it meant to be watched by a child who had learned that people left, that the world could be fine one morning and terrible by evening, and who was therefore investing very carefully in where she directed her trust. She didn't take it lightly. The weight of it was something she carried deliberately, the way you carry something fragile. It was in the third week that Caroline Mercer found her next angle. Eleanor had known something was coming. She had learned, over years, to recognize the particular quiet that preceded a coordinated effort, the way certain kinds of opposition don't announce themselves. They simply become atmospheric, a pressure you feel before you can name. The pressure this time came in the form of a petition. She learned about it from Margaret Fowler, the woman who ran the boarding house, who was not a complicated person but was essentially decent and had the virtue of telling Eleanor things directly rather than letting her discover them through the town's elaborate network of implication. Caroline's been going door to door, Margaret said, over the breakfast Eleanor ate alone at the kitchen table before the other boarders were up. Got some signatures, I don't know how many. Says the school board made their vote before the community had proper input. She poured coffee without being asked. Says there ought to be another vote. Eleanor set down her fork. How many names? She asked. Don't know. More than a few. Hollis's wife for certain. The Granger family. They've got 3 children who aren't attending, which I think says enough about their judgment. Margaret sat across from her, which she didn't usually do. I want you to know I didn't sign it. Thank you, Margaret. I signed the other one. Eleanor looked up. What other one? Margaret smiled, which did something good to her whole face. Caleb Warren had one going the other direction. Don't ask me how he managed it. That man barely says 10 words in a week. But he was over at Dutton's office with 6 names on it before Caroline even got to the south end of Main Street. She stood, refilled her own coffee. Town split, Eleanor. I won't pretend otherwise. But you're not as alone as you might think. Eleanor ate the rest of her breakfast and walked to school and taught Thomas about fractions and watched something clarify slowly in his face as the concept, which he'd been approaching from the wrong end, suddenly revealed itself from the right one. She taught Rose to write her mother's name in cursive, because Rose had asked quietly at the end of the previous day whether cursive was hard to learn, and Eleanor had said it depended on the word, and Rose had whispered a name, Frances. And Eleanor had said they would start there. She watched Rose trace the letters. She watched the care the girl took, the way her tongue pressed against her lip in concentration, the way she finally lifted her pencil and looked at what she'd made with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but something that lived between them. Eleanor kept teaching. She kept showing up. Because whatever Caroline Mercer was building outside these walls, inside these walls there were children who needed something that only happened when someone stayed. And Eleanor Whitaker, whatever else could be said about her, was very good at staying. By the end of the 4th week, 3 things had happened that no one had quite anticipated. The first was that Thomas Warren, unprompted, had read a full paragraph aloud in class. Not fluently. He still labored over certain words, still stopped and restarted. But he got through it, all the way to the period at the end, and when he looked up, the expression on his face was one Eleanor recognized as the specific, cautious wonder of a person who has just found out they can do something they believed they couldn't. The other children in the room had been quiet in the particular way children are quiet when they understand that something important is happening, even if they can't explain why. Eleanor had said, Good. Do the next one. He'd looked at her. The next paragraph? Unless you think you can't. He'd looked back at the book. And after a moment, after that moment where pride and fear have their argument and one of them wins, he'd put his finger under the next line and started again. The second thing that happened was that Eliza Dutton, wife of the land office owner and one of the women whose name Eleanor had been told appeared on Caroline's petition, had come to the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon with her youngest child, a girl of 6 named Pearl, and stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that suggested she was not entirely sure of herself, and then said, "I hear you've been doing well with the Morrison children. I'd like Pearl to start next week." "She's welcome," Eleanor said. Eliza Dutton had nodded, adjusted her grip on her daughter's hand, and walked away. She had not apologized for her name on the petition. Eleanor had not asked her to. There was a kind of reconciliation that only happened through action, and Eleanor had learned not to wait for the words. The third thing was the uglier one. She found it on a Monday morning, the word written on the chalkboard in someone's hand, in letters large enough to read from the door. A single word. The kind of word that people who have decided you are less than human use to remind you of that decision. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at it. Then she went in, picked up the eraser, and cleaned the board. She set out the lesson for the day. She wound the clock on the wall. She sharpened the pencils that needed sharpening. And when the children arrived, 7 of them now, one more desk filled than last week, she taught them about rivers, about how they carve their channels not by force but by persistence, wearing through rock not with violence but with constant, patient contact over time. She did not tell anyone what she had found on the board, but Caleb knew. She wasn't sure how. Maybe Margaret had seen someone at the schoolhouse before dawn and mentioned it. Maybe the town was small enough that someone had seen something. But when she came out of the schoolhouse at the end of the day, he was leaning against the wall outside with the specific expression of a man who is angry on someone else's behalf and managing it poorly. "You should have reported it," he said. "To who?" Eleanor asked. "The school board?" He didn't answer that because there was no good answer. "I cleaned it off," she said. "The children didn't see it. That's not the point." "I know it's not the point." She looked at him. "But it's the part I could control." He stood there a moment longer with his jaw set and his hat in his hands, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He turned and looked at the schoolhouse door, at the space where the word had been written, though from out here you couldn't see the board. And then he looked back at her with an expression that had changed into something less angry and more settled, and he said, "I'm going to fix that hinge." She blinked. "What hinge?" "The one on your door. It's been squeaking since you got here." He put his hat on. "I'll do it tonight after the shop closes, if that's all right. Bring some proper grease." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. This man who had been showing up in small, persistent ways since the day she arrived, who was not the kind of man who made speeches about what he believed, but who was also not the kind of man who stood aside when something was wrong. "That's all right," she said. He nodded once and walked back toward his shop, and Eleanor picked up her bag and started the walk to Margaret's boarding house. And the sky above Raven Creek was doing something complicated with the late afternoon light that she didn't have a name for, but that made the dust in the street look almost gold. She did not feel all right precisely, but she felt the specific, durable thing that comes from knowing that you are not entirely unseen. She kept walking. The town stretched around her, imperfect and difficult and full of people who had already decided about her, and full of children who had not yet decided anything, and she was the teacher at the end of the street, and she was not going anywhere. The hinge on the schoolhouse door stopped squeaking on a Tuesday. Eleanor noticed it the following morning when she arrived before dawn to light the stove. She pushed the door open, and the silence where the noise had been was so complete that she stood in the doorway for a moment before she understood what had changed. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that accumulates, that you don't account for until you find yourself standing in a doorway at 5 in the morning, realizing that someone has been paying attention to you in ways you haven't been paying attention to. She lit the stove and set the kettle on and arranged the day's lessons on her desk. And she didn't mention the hinge when Thomas and Rose arrived with their father that morning. Caleb dropped them at the door the way he did every day. He never came in, just waited long enough to see them through the door, then went back to the shop. And Eleanor said good morning to the children, and they said good morning back. Thomas, with the particular loudness of a boy who had not yet figured out his indoor voice, and Rose with the particular quietness of a girl who used hers as a form of self-preservation. The 5th week was where things began to shift in ways that weren't dramatic enough to name, but were real enough to feel. Thomas had been struggling with a specific problem since the beginning. Not reading exactly, not anymore, because the reading was coming slowly, but it was coming, but with the gap between what he understood in his head and what he was able to put on paper. He could look at a problem and work it through in his mind with a speed that surprised her, but the moment he had to write it down, something seized up, and the answer that had been perfectly clear 30 seconds earlier became inaccessible. She had watched it happen 3 times before she understood what she was seeing. "Stop writing for a minute," she told him one morning. He looked up. The other children were working independently at their desks, and Eleanor had crouched beside Thomas's seat in a way that kept the conversation between the two of them. "Just tell me the answer," she said. "Don't write it. Just say it." He looked at the problem. 43, he said immediately. "Right." She pointed to his paper. "Now write 43. He wrote it. "Now write how you got there." He started to freeze and she said quickly, "You're not writing it for anyone to read. You're just writing down what happened in your head, like leaving a trail so you can find your way back." He was quiet a moment, his pencil hovering over the paper. Then something in his face changed, not dramatically, just a small rearrangement around the eyes. And he bent down and wrote 3 lines, and the 3 lines were messy, and the handwriting was uneven, and the logic was expressed in a way that no grammar teacher would have approved of, but it was there. It was right. "That's what I mean," Eleanor said. He looked at what he'd written. "That's it?" "That's it." He looked at it a moment longer and then, in the manner of 11-year-old boys everywhere, immediately tried to appear as though this hadn't mattered to him at all, picking at the edge of his desk and looking out the window. But she'd seen his face for a fraction of a second before the performance went up, and she filed it away. Rose had been watching from the back row. Eleanor glanced at her, and Rose immediately dropped her eyes to her own paper, but not before Eleanor caught the expression on her face. Something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. The private kind of expression that crosses a child's face when they've seen something they find quietly good. That afternoon, at the end of the school day, Rose came to Eleanor's desk while Thomas was outside kicking a rock around the dirt in front of the building. She stood at the edge of the desk for a moment with both hands at her sides. "Miss Whitaker," she said. "Rose. My mother used to write her name in a book." She said it carefully, the way she said most things, choosing each word first. "A green book. She wrote her name inside the front cover." Eleanor waited. "I don't know what it says," Rose said. "The rest of it. I only know the name part." "What kind of book is it?" Rose thought about this. "I don't know. It has small writing. Papa keeps it on the shelf in the back room." She paused. "He doesn't open it." Eleanor looked at her. "Would you like to be able to read it?" Rose met her eyes directly, which she didn't always do. "Yes," she said. That was all. She went back to collect her things, and Thomas came back in from outside with dirt on his knees, and Caleb appeared at the door a few minutes later to collect them. Eleanor watched them go and then sat at her desk in the cooling room for a while without doing anything in particular. She had taught enough children to know that this was the moment that mattered. Not the lesson plan, not the curriculum, not the documented learning outcomes that a school board could measure. This was the thing you couldn't put on paper. A child telling you what she actually wanted. A child trusting you with the real thing. She wasn't going to waste it. The petition had 31 names on it, according to Margaret, who had sources Eleanor never asked about and was grateful for. Caroline Mercer had presented it to Gerald Pratt on a Friday afternoon, and Pratt had sent Eleanor a note, carefully worded, the note of a man walking a line he found increasingly uncomfortable, informing her that the board would need to convene a community meeting within the month to address what he called the concerns raised by a significant portion of the community's parents. Eleanor read the note twice, folded it, and put it in her desk drawer with the other documentation she was accumulating. She was accumulating quite a bit of it. She had started doing this in her second year of teaching, after a situation in her second school that had taught her something she'd never forgotten, that the people who wanted to remove you always counted on the fact that you were too tired and too beaten down to have kept records. She had made a habit since then of writing things down. Dates, times, names, what was said and by whom. She had the note from Gerald Pratt. She had a record of the word on the chalkboard. She'd written it in her own notebook that morning, the date and what she'd found and the fact that she had reported it to no one because there was no one to report it to who would have done anything useful. She had the names of the families who had initially kept their children home and the names of the ones who had since brought them back, and what she knew of the reasons for each. She was not a person who waited passively for things to resolve themselves. She was a person who prepared. What she had not prepared for was the conversation that happened on a Wednesday evening when she was walking back from the post office and nearly collided with Ada Hollis in front of the dry goods store. Ada Hollis was the woman who had pulled her boys from school in the first week, the wife of the rancher who had voted against Eleanor at the board meeting. She was in her 30s, with the particular tiredness of a woman who had been managing too many things for too long, and she had the look of someone who was not at all pleased to find herself in this specific doorway at this specific moment with this specific person. "Mrs. Hollis," Eleanor said. Ada looked at her. She looked at the space above Eleanor's head. She looked at the post office across the street. Then she looked back at Eleanor. "My older boy," she said. "Emmett. He's 12 and he has trouble with his letters. We've tried." She stopped, started again. "My husband says it's because he doesn't apply himself, but I've watched him try. I've sat with him for 2 hours and watched him try, and I don't—" She cut herself off. Her jaw was tight. "I don't think it's that." Eleanor was quiet. She did not fill the silence, because she had learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is not fill the silence. "What do you think it is?" Ada asked finally, and the question cost her something. Eleanor could see it cost her something. "I'd need to spend some time with him before I could tell you anything useful," Eleanor said. "But what you're describing, trying hard and still not being able to hold the letters, that's something I've seen before. It's not a character problem." Ada's expression shifted, and in the shift Eleanor saw something she recognized, the particular relief of a mother who has been told that the thing she suspected wasn't her child's fault might not be her child's fault. "I signed the petition," Ada said. "Not an apology, a fact." "I know," Eleanor said. "My husband—" She stopped again. "You don't need to explain it to me," Eleanor said, and she meant it. She was not in the business of requiring people to earn their way back to her. She was in the business of teaching children who needed teaching. "Could you see him?" Ada asked. "Not at the school. Not yet. I don't know what— I'd have to talk to my husband, but could you come by on Saturday morning," Eleanor said. "Bring Emmett. We can see what's going on." Ada Hollis nodded once, the way someone nods when they've done something difficult and aren't entirely sure they're glad they did it. Then she walked around Eleanor and into the dry goods store, and Eleanor continued down the street to the boarding house. She did not mention it to anyone. She put it in her notebook with the date and the approximate time and what had been said, and she went to bed and slept, which she'd gotten better at since coming to Raven Creek, though it had taken 3 weeks. Emmett Hollis came on Saturday morning with his mother and without his father, which told Eleanor something. He was a big boy for 12, already carrying his father's frame, with reddish hair and the expression of someone who has been told they are stupid often enough to have started believing it. Eleanor watched him walk through the schoolhouse door with the specific posture of a child who expects to fail in front of someone new and is angry about it in advance. She did not sit him at a desk. She stood at the window with him and asked him to look at something outside, a hawk on the fence post at the edge of the field. And while he was looking, she asked him to describe it. He described it with startling precision and an unselfconscious vocabulary that told her, immediately, that there was nothing wrong with this child's mind. Then she handed him a piece of paper with a sentence on it and asked him to read it. He read the first 3 words and stopped. He tried the 4th, started it wrong, corrected himself, lost the thread. By the time he got to the period at the end of the 2nd line, he had read the same sentence 4 times, and his face had the shuttered, angry look of someone expecting a response that confirmed what they already believed about themselves. Eleanor took the paper back. "You see individual letters just fine," she said. "But when you put them together into a word, something switches around." He stared at her. "What?" "The letters. They don't stay in order when you're reading them, or they look like other letters." She kept her voice matter-of-fact, clinical, the way she'd talk about any observed phenomenon. "Your mind does something with them that other people's minds don't do. It's not stupidity. It's just your brain built a different road." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not relief. Not quite. More like the expression of a person who has been told the thing that has been wrong their whole life has a name, and the name is not what they thought it was. "Can I still learn?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Differently, but yes." Ada Hollis sat quietly in the back of the room through all of this, and when Eleanor glanced at her near the end of the hour, the woman's eyes were bright in a way she was clearly not planning to acknowledge. They worked for 2 hours that first Saturday. Eleanor didn't try to do everything. She focused on one specific technique, tracing letters while saying them aloud, coupling the sound to the physical movement in a way that bypassed the visual confusion. Emmett resisted for the first 15 minutes, and then, with the particular stubbornness of a child who has been told something might actually work, began to try it seriously. He left with something she hadn't sent him in with. She couldn't have named it precisely, but she'd seen it before, in other children, and it was the thing that preceded actual learning, the decision, made somewhere below the level of thought, to allow the possibility. That evening, word reached her through Margaret that Daniel Hollis had found out about the Saturday visit and had not been pleased about it. Margaret delivered this information with the directness Eleanor appreciated in her and without embellishment. He said she went behind his back, Margaret said. She came to see me, Eleanor said. I didn't go looking for them. I know that and you know that. Margaret set a cup of coffee on the table between them. Whether he believes it is a different matter. Does he sign the things Caroline Mercer puts in front of him? Margaret considered. Has so far. Eleanor nodded. She drank her coffee. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had learned, over years, that the most dangerous opposition was not the opposition that came from hostility, but the opposition that came from fear, from men like Daniel Hollis, who had organized their lives around a particular version of the world, and who experienced any disruption to that version as a personal threat. You couldn't argue with fear. You could only keep doing what you were doing and wait for it to encounter something that outweighed it. The something, in this case, was a 12-year-old boy who was going home and doing his exercises. It was a Thursday, the 6th week, when the thing with the green book happened. Caleb had mentioned it once, briefly, in the way he mentioned most things that mattered to him, almost sideways, as though coming at it directly would require more than he currently had available. He had said that his wife Frances had kept a journal, that she'd written in it regularly right up until the fever made it impossible, and that he hadn't opened it since she'd died. He had said this while fixing something on Eleanor's stove. He had, without announcement or discussion, taken on the habit of attending to small broken things in the schoolhouse, and she had, without announcement or discussion, stopped mentioning it. And he'd said it with the flatness of a man discussing something he had decided to be flat about. Eleanor had not pressed him on it. She had filed it alongside what Rose had told her about the green book on the shelf and the name written inside the cover, and she had waited, because waiting was sometimes the only tool that worked. Rose brought it up again on a Thursday afternoon, after the other children had gone, and Thomas was outside, and it was just Eleanor and Rose in the cooling schoolroom, Rose still at her desk working on a letter she was writing to no one in particular. It was an exercise Eleanor had introduced for children who needed to practice, but found artificial tasks unconvincing, the instruction being simply to write a letter to whoever you feel like writing a letter to, and Rose had been at it for 4 days in a row. I looked at the book last night, Rose said. She was not looking up. She was still writing. Your mother's book? I could read my mother's name, the way you showed me. A pause. There were other words I couldn't read. That's all right. I wrote them down. Rose reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small folded piece of paper, which she brought to Eleanor's desk and set on it. Can you tell me what they say? Eleanor unfolded the paper. It was covered in a child's careful copying, letters transcribed exactly without understanding, the way a person copies something in a foreign script, faithful to the shapes even without knowing what the shapes mean. Eleanor looked at the words. Some of them were ordinary words from the front matter of the journal, a date, a place name. But near the top, in what must have been the first line of the first entry, were 4 words that Frances Warren had written as the first thing she'd said on the first page. Eleanor sat very still for a moment. What does it say? Rose asked. Eleanor looked at her. It says, My children are everything. The room was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, Thomas was still kicking his rock, the sound of it irregular and unhurried. Rose looked at the paper. Then she looked at Eleanor. Her face was doing something complicated and private, the way children's faces do when they're processing something too large for the moment to contain. She wrote it at the beginning? Rose asked. First line, Eleanor said. Rose nodded. She reached out and took the paper back and folded it with careful hands and returned it to her pocket. And then she went back to her desk and sat down and picked up her pencil. They didn't talk about it again that afternoon. But when Caleb came to collect the children at the end of the day, Rose went to him when he appeared in the doorway, which she didn't usually do. She usually waited until he called her name. And she put her arms around his waist and her face against his coat, and he looked down at her with an expression that was utterly unprepared, the expression of a man caught off guard by something that goes directly to the place you've been guarding, and he put his hand on the back of her head and held on. Thomas had stopped in the middle of the room and was watching this with the expression of a boy who doesn't want to be seen watching. Eleanor found something very important to organize on her desk. Caleb looked up eventually. He looked at Eleanor across the top of Rose's head, and he didn't say anything, but the look was the kind that contains a question and an answer simultaneously. Eleanor gave him a small nod, the kind that says, "It's all right, I'll tell you later," without using words, and he held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before he looked back down at his daughter. "Come on then," he said quietly. "Let's go home." The community meeting was set for the last Friday of the month, and the town spent the 2 weeks preceding it in a state of low-grade agitation that Eleanor felt everywhere she went: at the post office, at Margaret's table, at the dry goods store where the woman behind the counter had signed Caroline's petition, but still took Eleanor's money without comment when she came in to buy chalk. Eleanor went every morning and taught. She had 9 students now. Pearl Dutton had been there 3 weeks and was already ahead of where her mother had expected her to be. Emmett Hollis had not officially enrolled. His father's position on that was still unclear, but he came on Saturday mornings and had started doing something that Eleanor recognized as practicing on his own during the week, based on the small improvements she saw each session. 3 other children from families she hadn't expected had appeared in the second month, their parents offering explanations that amounted to, "We heard things were going well," delivered with the awkwardness of people who knew they'd been slow to arrive. Thomas had read 3 pages of a chapter book, 3 consecutive pages, aloud, in front of the other children, without stopping. It had taken him 11 minutes, which Eleanor knew because she'd glanced at the clock when he started and glanced at it when he finished, and she hadn't told him she was doing it because the point was not the time. The point was the 3 pages. When he finished, he'd closed the book and put it on his desk, and looked at Eleanor with his chin up in the particular posture of a boy waiting to find out if what he'd done was enough. "Page 4 tomorrow," she said. He'd turned his face away fast, but not fast enough. Rose had started raising her hand in class. Not every question, not yet, but a few. She did it with the tentative precision of a child field testing a new behavior, watching to see what happened when she extended herself before deciding whether to extend further. Eleanor called on her consistently, which was the only answer to that kind of testing, not with special attention or excessive praise, but with the same matter-of-fact respect she gave every other child in the room. "Yes, Rose, what do you think?" And Rose would answer, and Eleanor would respond to what she said, and the world would continue, and the next time Rose's hand would go up a fraction faster. Caleb noticed. He mentioned it one evening when Eleanor was locking the schoolhouse, and he'd appeared at the edge of the building the way he sometimes did. Not to talk exactly, he rarely arrived with a specific purpose, but because he seemed to find it natural to be in the vicinity at the end of the day. He was leaning against the exterior wall with his arms crossed, not quite looking at her. "Rose set the table for dinner last night," he said. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And?" "She used to. After Francis died, she stopped doing the small things, stopped doing a lot of things." He was quiet. "She set the table last night, and she told Thomas to move his boots before someone tripped on them, and Thomas actually moved his boots." He looked at Eleanor then, a direct look that had the quality of admitting something. "I don't know what you're doing in there, but it's working." "It's not me specifically," Eleanor said. "It's the fact that she has somewhere to be every day where someone expects things from her." "No," Caleb said. "It's you." He said it without flourish, the way he said most things. "She talks about you, not a lot. But when she does, it's—" He stopped. "She doesn't talk about people she doesn't trust." Eleanor looked at him. The late light was doing the complicated gold thing with the dust again, and the street was quieter than it had been earlier, most of the town having retreated inside for supper. "Mr. Warren," she started. "Caleb," he said. He'd said it before once, in the first week, but she'd kept the formality because formality was safer. Now he said it again with the patient simplicity of a man who is not asking for much, just the correct name. She looked at him for a moment. Caleb. He nodded once, the small, satisfied nod of a person who has been waiting for something simple to happen and is relieved it finally did. I appreciate what you've told me, she said. About Rose. About Thomas. She paused. It matters to hear it. I expect it doesn't happen as often as it should, he said. She didn't answer that because the answer was obvious, and she didn't particularly want to spend the next 5 minutes in the kind of conversation that required her to manage the other person's guilt on her behalf. Instead, she said, The meeting's on Friday. I know. His expression shifted into something more careful. I'll be there. You don't have to. I'll be there, he said again, with the specific quality of a statement that is not inviting debate. She looked at him. There was something she wanted to say and something she didn't know how to say, and they were not the same thing. What she wanted to say was that she had spent her whole life managing these battles alone, and she had gotten quite good at it, and she was not sure how to navigate a situation where someone intended to stand with her. What she didn't know how to say was that she was not sure she deserved it, which she knew intellectually was wrong, but which persisted anyway. The ghost of every year of being told she was less than. What she said was, The children are doing well. Yeah, Caleb said, they are. He pushed off the wall and walked back toward the forge. Eleanor stood in the street and watched him go. The week continued. The town buzzed with its own particular agitation. Caroline Mercer's petition was being treated as a referendum on things that had nothing to do with reading and arithmetic, and everyone in Raven Creek seemed to know it, and most of them were too polite or too afraid or too invested in their own position to say it plainly. Eleanor taught. She was good at teaching. It was the one thing the world had never been able to take from her, no matter how many times it had tried to tell her that she was the wrong kind of person to do it. She taught Thomas, and she taught Rose, and she taught Pearl Dutton, and she taught Emmett Hollis on Saturdays, and she taught the 3 new children who had arrived in the 2nd month. And she did not allow any of what was happening outside the schoolhouse walls to come through the door with her in the morning. The door with the fixed hinge, that opened and closed without a sound. The meeting was coming. She knew what it would be. She had been in rooms like it before, in other towns, and she knew how they smelled and how they sounded and how the people who had been watching sat in the back, and the people who had things to prove sat in the front, and how Caroline Mercer would stand at the front of the room with her 31 names, and her particular gift for presenting the language of respectability over the architecture of exclusion. She knew all of that. What she didn't know yet was what Caleb Warren intended to do about it, and what it would cost him, and whether the town of Raven Creek was capable of something that most towns, in her experience, were not especially good at. But Friday was coming, and she would be in that room, and she would have her documentation, and she would have her 9 students and their improvements, and the 3 pages Thomas had read, and the name Rose had traced in cursive, and the way Emmett Hollis's face had looked when she'd told him that the word for what happened to his letters in his head was not stupid. She would have all of that. It would have to be enough. The community meeting was held in the feed store, which was the largest interior space in Raven Creek, and which smelled, inescapably, of grain dust and old wood, and the particular animal warmth of a building that had absorbed decades of the town's business. Someone had arranged wooden chairs in rows facing a table at the front, and by the time Eleanor arrived, most of those chairs were occupied. She came alone. She had told Margaret not to come on her behalf, and Margaret had said she would come on her own behalf, which Eleanor had accepted because there was no arguing with Margaret when she'd made up her mind about something. She sat in the 3rd row, not the back. She had learned that sitting in the back of rooms like this was a form of concession. With her notebook on her knee and her documentation folded inside it, and her hand settled in her lap with a stillness she had practiced so long it no longer required effort. The room filled around her. She did not turn to look. She could hear the particular acoustics of a room deciding where to place itself. The people who supported her finding seats near her. The people who didn't finding seats across the room. The majority settling in the uncertain middle in the way that uncertain majorities do. Gerald Pratt sat at the front table with 2 other board members. Caroline Mercer did not sit. She stood slightly to the side of the table with the posture of a woman who had prepared for this and was satisfied with her preparation. The meeting opened the way these things always opened. Procedural language, statement of purpose, The careful bureaucratic framing that existed to give the appearance of neutrality to a process that was not neutral. Pratt read from a paper. Caroline stood without moving. Then Pratt said, "Mrs. Mercer, I understand you've requested time to address the board and the community." "I have," Caroline said. She spoke for 10 minutes. Eleanor had expected longer. Caroline was too intelligent to ramble. She made her points with the precision of someone who had edited herself down to what was actually effective, which was, Eleanor had to admit, the work of a person who understood how these rooms functioned. She talked about community standards. She talked about the responsibilities of institutions to reflect the values of the people they served. She talked about parents who had come to her with concerns, about the obligation of the school board to those parents, about the difference between qualifications on paper and the lived reality of what it meant to stand in front of their children and represent what was possible for them. She did not once say the word weight or appearance or body. She didn't need to. The architecture of what she was saying was perfectly legible without it to every person in the room, and everyone in the room knew it. When she finished, Pratt said, "Is there anyone else who would like to address the board?" The room shifted. Eleanor stood. She did not bring notes to the front. She brought the notebook because her documentation was in it, and she intended to use the documentation, but she did not read from it because reading from notes would make her seem like someone who needed the notes. She had rehearsed this. Not the words exactly. She had learned that rehearsing exact words made you rigid, made you lose the thread the moment something unexpected happened, but the structure of it, the sequence of things she needed to say. "My name is Eleanor Whitaker," she said, which was unnecessary since everyone in the room knew who she was, but which established that she was beginning on her own terms. "I have been teaching in Raven Creek for 7 weeks. I currently have 9 students enrolled, with 1 additional student receiving supplemental instruction on Saturday mornings." She opened the notebook and took out the first sheet. "In those 7 weeks, every enrolled student has demonstrated measurable improvement. Thomas Warren, age 11, has progressed from being unable to read connected text to reading 3 consecutive pages of a chapter-level book independently. Pearl Dutton, age 6, began without the ability to write her own name and can now read and write at the expected level for her age. Emmett," she paused here because Emmett was a complication, because his father had not wanted this conversation, and she was about to have it anyway. "A student receiving Saturday instruction has made substantial progress despite a documented learning difference that was previously unaddressed and misidentified as a conduct problem." She heard something shift in the room behind her. She didn't look. "I have documentation of each of these improvements. They are available to the board for review." She put the paper down. "I also have a record of the word that was written on my chalkboard in the 5th week of my employment. I have the date and a description and the names of the 2 children who arrived early enough that morning to have potentially seen it, though I cleaned it before they entered." She said this without heat, because heat would let people dismiss it as emotion. "That is also available to the board for review." The room was very quiet. "I understand what this meeting is actually about," Eleanor said. "And I want to say plainly that I have heard what Mrs. Mercer has said, and I recognize that she is speaking for a group of people in this community who have a genuine feeling about what I represent to them. I'm not going to tell those people they are wrong to have feelings." She looked at Caroline directly, for the first time since she'd stood up. "I'm going to tell this board that the children of this town are learning. That is the purpose of a school teacher, and I am asking the board to weigh what is actually happening against what some members of this community would prefer to feel." She sat down. The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. Then Caleb Warren stood up. He was in the back row. Eleanor had not seen him come in, had not looked for him, had not wanted to know before she spoke whether he was there because it would have changed something in her that she needed to stay unchanged. She turned, with everyone else, to look at him. He was not a man who gave speeches. Eleanor had understood this about him from early on. He expressed himself through action, through showing up, through the fixed hinge and the repaired stove, and the Saturday mornings he'd spent building a reputation for Eleanor's teaching by quietly talking to Dutton and to the Morrisons and to 3 other families she hadn't known about. Words in front of a room were not his native language, and it showed. He held his hat in his hands. He looked at the front table, not at Caroline, not at Eleanor. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm going to say it plain because I'm not good at the other kind." No one spoke. My son couldn't read when September started. He can read now. My daughter had stopped. He stopped himself, rearranged. She's doing better, in ways I couldn't manage on my own. He turned his hat once. I've been in this town 20 years. I've watched two other teachers leave. I watched a third one last winter who we didn't even have. I watched my kids fall behind because there was no one here who stayed long enough to matter. He looked at Pratt now. Miss Whitaker's been here 7 weeks and she's already the person my children talk about at dinner. If this board decides that's less important than what she looks like, then I don't know what to tell you. I just don't know what to tell you. He sat down. The chair scraped the wooden floor and the sound of it was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, Ada Hollis stood up. Eleanor turned again, and she was not the only one surprised. She could feel the surprise travel through the room, could feel Caroline Mercer's attention snap to Ada with the precision of a woman recalculating. Ada was looking at the front table. Her face was the face of a woman who has decided to do something that is going to cost her domestically and has decided to do it anyway. My boy Emmett has been going to Saturday lessons, she said. For 4 weeks. His father doesn't... She stopped, started again. He's reading better. He's reading, which is something I wasn't sure was going to happen. She looked at her hands and then back up at the table. I don't think Caroline is wrong that a teacher ought to represent something to our children. I just think what she represents ought to be that learning matters, and you don't give up, and you show up even when people tell you you shouldn't be there. She sat down quickly, as if she'd used up what she'd prepared and wanted to get back to the ground. Caroline Mercer, who had been standing with a stillness that was itself a performance, said, "What Mrs. Hollis describes as commendable. Individual progress does not... I have something else to say." The voice came from the back left corner, and Eleanor turned to find Margaret Fowler on her feet, with her coat still buttoned and her hat still on, which meant she had intended to stay only long enough to say this. "I've been in this town 32 years, Margaret said. I've watched a lot of things happen here. I watched 3 teachers leave. I watched the schoolhouse sit empty for 9 months last year, while Caroline sat on the board and couldn't find anyone suitable enough." She looked at Caroline directly. "Eleanor Whitaker has been suitable enough to stay. Every morning, 7 weeks, rain and cold, and after someone wrote on her board in the night, she opened that door and she taught." She pulled her coat straighter. "I'll sit back down now, but I wanted it said." She sat. Gerald Pratt looked at his hands. Then he looked at the 2 board members on either side of him, a brief look that passed information efficiently. Then he looked at Caroline. "Mrs. Mercer," he said carefully, "I think the board has heard from the community." Caroline's face did not change. It was one of the things Eleanor had to, despite everything, respect about her. The absolute control she maintained over her surface. "The community that signed my petition," she began. 31 names, Pratt said. "And I've heard tonight from people who weren't on your petition." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm going to move that the board reaffirm Miss Whitaker's appointment and table any further discussion of this matter until the end of the academic year, at which point we will review based on student outcomes." He looked at the other 2 board members. "Seconded?" One of them, Dutton, the land office man, whose daughter was currently above grade level, said, "Seconded." The third, the minister Garrett, who had been examining the ceiling again throughout, said, "Aye." Caroline Mercer said nothing. She picked up her papers from the table, aligned them with a small precise movement, and walked to her seat. Her face was still controlled, but something in the set of her jaw had changed, the change that happens when a person who is used to winning encounters the specific quality of a loss they hadn't fully prepared for. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific, exhausted relief of someone who has been braced for impact and been told the impact is coming later, rather than not coming at all, because Caroline Mercer was not finished. Eleanor knew that about her. But later was later, and tonight was tonight. That she was the last one out of the feed store. She waited until most of the room had emptied, straightening her notebook and her documentation with the thoroughness of someone who needs a few minutes of purposeful activity before they can trust themselves to walk in a straight line. Caleb was waiting outside. She had not asked him to, and she was not surprised. "You did good in there," he said. "You did something too," she said. He shrugged in the way he shrugged off most things that required acknowledgement of himself. "I said what was true." "In front of a room full of people who have opinions about you," Eleanor said. That's not nothing, Caleb. He looked at her for a moment. The street was quiet. The other attendees dispersed into the dark in twos and threes. Margaret had already gone, which Eleanor was grateful for because Margaret had a talent for appearing at exactly the moment when Eleanor would have appreciated less company. Ada Hollis is going to have a hard time at home tonight, Eleanor said. Probably. He looked down the street toward the Hollis place. Daniel will come around eventually. He's not a bad man. He's built his idea of himself around being right about things, and it's hard to be built that way. You know him well? We went to school together, years back. He paused. Same one-room schoolhouse, different teacher. Eleanor looked at him. Was she any good? Caleb considered this with the seriousness he brought to most questions. She was adequate, he said. She didn't stay either. Eleanor laughed, which surprised her. It came out quiet and a little tired, but it was genuine. Caleb looked at her when she laughed. Not with surprise exactly, more with the expression of someone seeing a thing they hadn't seen before and finding it worth seeing. What? She said. Nothing, he said. It's just, you don't laugh much. No, she agreed. I don't. He was quiet. Then he said, You should get some sleep. Friday lessons tomorrow. Saturday lessons, she said. Friday is Friday. Right. He put his hat on. Emmett's been practicing during the week. I heard it from his mother. He traces letters on the table when he thinks no one's watching. Eleanor felt something warm and specific move through her chest. Good, she said. Yeah. Caleb looked at her once more, the direct look that seemed to come to him more easily than it came to most people. Good night, Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She registered it the way you register a door opening into a room you didn't know was there. Not with alarm, but with a sudden awareness of a new dimension. Good night, she said. She walked back to the boarding house alone under a clear sky with more stars than she'd been used to from Ohio. And she did not think about Caroline Mercer or the vote or what came next. She thought about Thomas reading 3 pages. She thought about Rose's face when Eleanor told her what her mother had written on the first page of the journal. She thought about Caleb using her name. She went to bed and slept, and in the morning she got up and opened the schoolhouse and lit the stove and set out the day's lessons, and the door opened without a sound. 3 weeks after the meeting, a letter arrived. Eleanor was at her desk during the noon break when Margaret brought it in. Margaret had taken to receiving Eleanor's mail at the boarding house and walking it over personally, which Eleanor suspected was partly genuine helpfulness and partly a desire to know what was coming before Eleanor did, and she accepted both motivations. The letter was from a family named Aldrich. The name meant nothing to Eleanor. She read it twice. The Aldriches were a wealthy family in a city called Pemberton, 3 days' travel east. They had a daughter of 10 and twin boys of 8, and they were looking for a private tutor to come and live with the family and provide full-time instruction. The salary they named was nearly double what Raven Creek was paying her. The accommodations were described in terms that suggested the Aldriches were not people who thought twice about the cost of comfort. The letter was polite and formal and referenced, at the end, that they had received her name from a professor at the Ohio Normal School who had trained her and who had described her as, in his words, the finest student he had taught in 20 years of instruction. Eleanor folded the letter and put it in her desk drawer and did not look at it again for 3 days. The thing was, she had imagined this. Not this specifically, not an offer from a family named Aldrich in a city called Pemberton, but something like it, the escape door, the alternative, the version of her life where she went somewhere no one had already decided about her, where she started clean, where the accumulated weight of this specific battle didn't follow her through the door each morning. She had imagined it and had told herself the imagining was reasonable, that it was not weakness to want something easier, that a person could only sustain so much before they began to need relief. She taught the next 3 days and tried not to think about the letter, and thought about the letter constantly. Thomas had started bringing books home. She hadn't suggested it. He had asked, with the studied casualness of an 11-year-old who didn't want to seem enthusiastic, whether students could take books home to read, and she had said yes with equal casualness. And he had selected a book about frontier survival, animals, terrain, hunting, which was not what she would have picked for him, but which was exactly what he would pick for himself. and he had taken it home and brought it back the next morning with 4 pages read and a question about what a certain animal's behavior meant, a question that revealed he'd understood everything he'd read. Rose had started talking in class, not raising her hand, not answering questions, talking, contributing. Earlier that week, she had listened to another child make an error about geography and had said, with the quiet certainty of someone who knows they're right, "That's not where it is." Eleanor had said, "Tell us where it is, Rose." And Rose had told them, correctly, and the other child had accepted the correction without complaint, and Rose had sat back with a small expression that was unmistakably satisfaction. Eleanor watched all of this and thought about the letter in her desk, and understood that she was not going to answer it, had probably known from the first reading that she was not going to answer it, but hadn't been ready to close the door on it, because closing the door meant choosing this, with full awareness of what choosing this cost. On the third day, she took the letter out and read it one more time and then put it in the stove. She watched it catch. She watched the paper blacken and curl and become nothing that could be read. Then she went back to the lesson. She hadn't told anyone about the letter. That was her intention, to have made the decision privately, to have let it be a private thing, because not everything needed to be shared and she was not someone who narrated her inner life for an audience. But she had not accounted for Caleb Warren's particular quality of attention. He noticed something was different that afternoon. He came to collect the children, and she was washing the chalkboard, which she did at the end of every day, but which she was doing with more physical energy than the task required, and he stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before he spoke. "Something happened," he said. It was not a question. "I had a decision to make," she said, without turning around. "I made it." He didn't ask what the decision was. She had noticed this about him. He didn't push into spaces you hadn't opened. He waited. It was a quality she associated with people who had learned, through some specific experience, that pushing made things close. "Pemberton," she said. "A family there offered me a position." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was doing something careful with what it showed. "I burned the letter," she said. "This afternoon." He was quiet. Then he said, "Why?" "Because Thomas read 4 pages last night at home without being asked." She set the eraser down. "And because I'd like to see what Rose does by spring." He looked at her for a long time. There was something in the look that was above where she was comfortable, that went somewhere she was not entirely prepared for, and she held it anyway because she was 34 years old and had been navigating discomfort her whole life, and this was, at least, a more complicated kind. "I'm glad," he said finally. Simple, like most things he said. "Don't make it more than it is," she said, though she didn't mean it entirely. "I'm not making it anything," he said. "I'm just glad." Thomas appeared from the side room where he'd been getting his coat, and Rose came from her desk with her things arranged neatly in her arms, and the moment, whatever it had been, rearranged itself into the ordinary end of a school day, and Caleb put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder to steer him toward the door, and Rose said goodnight to Eleanor in her quiet voice. And they left. Eleanor stood in the empty room. She had stayed. She had chosen this. The difficult thing, the costly thing, the thing that did not come with a comfortable house in Pemberton, and a salary that acknowledged her worth, and a family who had never seen her before, and therefore had no standing prejudice. She had chosen 9 children in a one-room schoolhouse, in a town that had treated her like a problem to be solved, and she had chosen the man who had called her by her given name in a dark street and meant it as a simple, clean thing. She was not entirely sure what she had started by staying. She was sure she had started something. The following Monday, Daniel Hollis appeared at the schoolhouse door. Eleanor saw him from her desk during the early morning hour before students arrived. He filled the doorway in the way large men fill doorways, and he stood there for a moment without coming in, looking at the room the way men look at spaces they've already formed an opinion about and are checking the opinion against. Eleanor stood. "Mr. Hollis?" "I want to talk about my boy," he said. "Come in, then." He came in, far enough to clear the doorway, and stopped. He was a man of perhaps 45, with the build of someone who had worked outdoors his whole life, and he had his son's reddish hair gone mostly to gray, and his son's stubborn jaw, and none of his son's emerging willingness to be wrong about himself. "I hear he's been coming here on Saturdays," he said, "without my say-so." "He's been coming with his mother's knowledge," Eleanor said. I understand you weren't told. I wasn't. His jaw worked. I'm telling you now that I don't appreciate Mr. Hollis. She said it quietly, not to interrupt, but to interrupt. Emmett can read. Not perfectly. Not yet. But he's reading. 4 weeks ago, he couldn't read a sentence without losing the thread of it. Now he can. She let that sit. Whatever else you feel about me or about how he came to be here, that is what's true. He looked at her. She looked back. She had been looked at by men who needed her to be less than she was for long enough that she could identify the specific quality of it, the search for something that confirmed what they'd already decided. She watched his face go through that search and not quite find what it was looking for. He's behind, Daniel said. Yes, he's always been behind. I was never going to catch up on his own, Eleanor said. And he wasn't going to catch up by being told he didn't apply himself either, because that's not what's happening with him. He has a specific difficulty with how his eyes process written letters. It's not intelligence, it's mechanical, almost, like a wheel that runs slightly out of true. You compensate for it. You learn how to ride anyway, but you need someone to show you how. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Eleanor heard the clock on the wall tick several times, which she normally didn't notice. Can he catch up? He asked. The asking cost him something. She could see it cost him something. Yes, she said. It'll take time. He'll always work harder at reading than a child without the difficulty. But he can catch up. Daniel Hollis looked at the room again. At the books on the windowsill, the chalkboard with the next lesson already started, the 9 desks arranged so the smaller children were near the front. He looked at the desk Thomas sat in, which she could see him clocking. He would know, she suspected, which desk was Caleb Warren's boy's desk. I signed the petition, he said. I know. Ada shouldn't have gone behind my back. Eleanor did not answer that. It was not her marriage and not her place. He turned his hat in his hands, which she was apparently going to notice men doing in Raven Creek for the rest of her time here, because the ones who were working through something they hadn't planned to work through all ended up with their hats in their hands. Could he enroll? He said finally. Properly. Yes, Eleanor said. He can start Monday. Daniel nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked to the door and paused there with his back to her and said, without turning, He's a good boy. He is, Eleanor said. He just needed someone to show him a different road. He left. Eleanor stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she went to her desk and took out the enrollment register and wrote Emmett Hollis's name in the line below Pearl Dutton's, and she wrote it in her neat, careful hand, the hand she'd been developing since she was 12 years old in a one-room schoolhouse, not entirely unlike this one, where a teacher had placed her in the back of the room because she took up too much space. 10 students. She set down the pen. Through the window she could see the street beginning to wake up, the ordinary morning business of a frontier town arranging itself into the day. She could see the front of the blacksmith shop 2 doors down from the feed store, the door already open, the sound of the forge already starting its deep background rhythm that she had come to register without thinking about it, the way you register the sound of a river when you live near one. She had burned the Pemberton letter. She had 10 students. The door behind her opened and closed without a sound. She began the day. Emmett Hollis walked through the schoolhouse door on Monday morning with the expression of someone who had prepared themselves for something difficult and was unsure whether the difficulty would come from inside or outside. He was wearing a clean shirt. Eleanor noticed this the way she noticed most things about her students. Not obviously, not in a way that made them self-conscious, because a clean shirt on a Monday meant someone had wanted him to feel he was starting something properly. He took the desk at the end of the second row, the one farthest from the window, and he sat in it with his large frame slightly too big for the seat, and his hands flat on the surface and his eyes forward. Thomas was watching him from the desk to his left with the transparent curiosity of a boy who has already sorted new arrivals into categories before they've spoken, and Rose was watching from the back with the more patient observation that was her particular way. Eleanor said, "We're glad to have you, Emmett. You know the work we've been doing on Saturday mornings. We'll continue that here, alongside the rest of the class." She did not make a production of it. She moved to the board and started the morning lesson, and let him find his place in the rhythm of the room, the way all her students found it eventually, which was by discovering that the room had a rhythm and that it was not hostile. By mid-morning, he had stopped sitting like he was waiting to be told to leave. Thomas had, at some point between Monday's arrival and Tuesday's lunch, decided that Emmett was acceptable. Eleanor wasn't sure exactly how this had happened. It seemed to involve a conversation about horses that she caught only the end of, and something to do with a particular kind of knot used in ranching that Thomas wanted to know how to tie. But by Wednesday, the two boys were sitting together at the lunch break, talking in the low, rapid way of boys who have found they share a frequency, and Emmett was laughing at something Thomas said with the laugh of someone who had not expected to laugh today. Eleanor watched this from her desk and felt something settle in her that had been waiting to settle. She did not let herself rest in it too long. Resting in the good moments was a luxury she had learned to take carefully, in small doses, because the good moments in Raven Creek had a consistent habit of being preceded or followed by something that required her full attention. The something this time had been building for a week and arrived on a Thursday. Gerald Pratt came to the schoolhouse in the early afternoon while the children were working independently on their writing exercises. He knocked on the open door, which Eleanor appreciated. Some men walked into a schoolroom as if the fact of their position exempted them from courtesies, and she went to the door and stepped outside to speak with him so the children wouldn't be interrupted. Pratt was a man who delivered uncomfortable things with the expression of someone who had already apologized in advance in the mirror that morning. He stood in the thin October light and held his hat against his chest. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "Please," Eleanor said. "Caroline has been talking to some families. Not about the petition. She dropped the petition after the meeting, but she's been talking about the end of the year and about what the board's responsibility is in terms of renewal." He looked somewhere past her shoulder. "The board voted to review based on student outcomes. What she's arguing now is that outcome standards need to be set formally, in advance, so that the review has a concrete basis." Eleanor looked at him. "That sounds reasonable on its surface." "It is reasonable on its surface." He met her eyes briefly. "The problem is that she's the one proposing the standards, and what she's proposing is specific in ways that are designed to be difficult." "What kind of standards?" He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. She took it and read it. It was a single page, written in the careful hand of someone who had thought about every word, which meant Caroline had written it. The standards were numeric, specific test score thresholds that each student would need to meet, set against a timeline that was aggressive for children who had started from as far behind as several of Eleanor's students had started. She read to the bottom and then read it again. "These are set for where the children should be at the end of the year," she said, "not where they are now, not accounting for where they started." "Yes," Pratt said. "Emmett Hollis has been formally enrolled for 4 days. He's expected to meet the same reading threshold by December as children who have been in consistent schooling for years." "I know." She folded the paper. She held it. She thought about the way Emmett had laughed at lunch with Thomas, the laugh of someone remembering that this was still possible. "Is the board going to vote on these?" she asked. "Next Tuesday," Pratt said. "I voted for you in September, Miss Whitaker. I'll vote against these standards, but the math on the board has not improved since September." He had the grace to say it plainly. "I think it's likely to pass 3-2. I think Dutton may hold, but Garrett tends to vote with the majority in close questions, and I don't know where he'll come down on something this structured." Eleanor handed the paper back. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I wanted you to have time." He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which she credited him for. "I'm sorry it's not more." She went back inside and finished the afternoon. She told Caleb that evening. She had not planned to. She had planned to work through it herself, the way she worked through most things, privately and systematically. But when he appeared at the end of the day in his usual way, not announced, not with a purpose stated, just present in the vicinity, she found herself telling him because not telling him felt suddenly like a form of dishonesty that she didn't want between them. She showed him the paper. He read it in the way he read things, slowly and without visible reaction until he'd finished, and then he read it again. "This is not about standards," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "This is about making it so the numbers say she was right, even if the children are learning." He folded the paper with the controlled care of a man who would prefer to do something more forceful with it. "Emmett Hollis is supposed to meet a December threshold." "Yes." Caleb was quiet. He handed the paper back. He stood for a moment with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way she'd learned meant he was thinking something through rather than finished thinking. How many people would need to see what's actually happening in there? He said finally. Not the board. Parents. Eleanor looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, the board can vote to set whatever standards they want, but the board answers to the people who send their children here. If those people come in and see what you've done with their kids, see it directly. He stopped, reordered. The Dutton girl reads now. The Morrison boy reads. Thomas reads. He looked at her. Has anyone besides me and Daniel Hollis come into this room and actually watched you teach? She thought about it. No. Then that's the problem, he said. Caroline's been doing her work out there, in the street, at dinner tables, where you can't answer it. You've been doing your work in here, where it's real but it's invisible. He uncrossed his arms. Make it visible. Eleanor sat with that. An open day, she said slowly, or just let them come. Tell the parents they're welcome to observe any morning, not a performance, just come and see. She turned it over. The risk was obvious. A classroom that knew it was being watched was a different classroom, and children who were self-conscious performed differently than children who were comfortable. But her students were not fragile. Thomas had read 3 pages in front of his classmates without falling apart. Emmett had asked Eleanor a question in class on his 3rd day that he'd have been too ashamed to ask 4 weeks ago. Rose had corrected another child's geography. Next Thursday, she said. Caleb nodded. I'll talk to Dutton. You talk to Margaret. She almost told him she could manage the logistics herself, that she didn't need to be managed, and then she stopped, because he was not managing her. He was offering to carry part of something, the way you offer to carry part of something when you've decided the weight matters to you. She had not had much experience with this particular offering, and she was still learning what to do with it. All right, she said. Margaret, when told, said, took you long enough to think of it, which Eleanor chose to receive as enthusiasm. Word went out through the channels that word went out through in Raven Creek, which were primarily Margaret and the post office, and the early morning gathering of men outside the feed store that functioned as an informal news exchange. By Monday, Eleanor had heard from 7 families that they intended to come Thursday. By Wednesday, the number had grown to 11. She did not change her lessons for Thursday. She did not select the easiest material or arrange things to show her best students to advantage. She taught what she had planned to teach because she was not putting on a show. She was, as Caleb had said, making visible what was already happening. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. Eleanor lit the stove an hour early. She had 12 students now. Daniel Hollis had, without explanation or apology, but also without resistance, allowed his 2 younger children to enroll in the previous week, and they sat now in the first row with the accommodating blankness of children who have been told to behave and have mostly agreed to. The parents began arriving at 8:30. They came in 1s and 2s, and they took the chairs Eleanor had arranged along the side wall, and they sat with the slightly uncertain posture of adults, in a space designed for smaller people, and Eleanor looked at them once and then taught. She started with arithmetic, because arithmetic was the subject where Thomas was most visibly transformed. She put a problem on the board, a problem genuinely difficult for an 11-year-old, and she asked Thomas to solve it. She watched his father, Caleb, sitting at the end of the row of chairs, not watch Thomas, which was its own form of watching, the studied casualness of a man who needed the other adults in the room to see his son without the complication of his own visible investment. Thomas went to the board. He thought for a moment with the chalk in his hand, and Eleanor could see the old instinct toward shutdown flicker across his face and then resolve, because he had been through this enough times now in this room that the shutdown no longer had the authority it used to. He wrote the first step. He wrote the second. He got the answer and turned around with his chin at the angle that was his version of dignity and said 47. And Eleanor said, show the room you're working. And he turned back to the board and walked through it step by step. She heard from the chairs along the wall someone draw a slow breath. She moved to reading. She asked Rose to lead the class through the passage they'd been working on, which was 3 paragraphs from a natural history describing the behavior of migratory birds. Rose stood at the front of the room with the book in both hands, and she read it. Not quickly, not with the performed fluency of a child showing off, but with the careful, genuine attention of a child who is interested in what the words say and is reading them because she wants to know them. She read all 3 paragraphs. She stopped at one word she didn't know, said, "I don't know this word," and looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor told her, and Rose nodded and continued. Ada Hollis, in the chair third from the left, was not crying. She was not crying with the specific, determined effort of a woman who has decided she is not going to cry in front of people and is winning that battle by a thin margin. Emmett read aloud when it was his turn. He read a sentence. He read 2. He stumbled at the third, and Eleanor said quietly, "The technique, Shab. Trace it. Say it." And he traced the letter on his desk with his finger while saying it under his breath, and then he had it, and he kept going. He read 6 sentences before Eleanor moved on, and when he sat back down he looked at nothing particular, just forward, with the expression of a person who has done something they weren't sure they could do and is still processing the fact that they did it. Daniel Hollis sat at the far end of the chairs with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated that he was not inviting anyone to comment on. Eleanor taught for 2 hours. She did not perform, and she did not explain, and she did not narrate what the parents were seeing. She let them see it. At the end of the 2 hours, she dismissed the children for a break, and the room shifted. Children going outside, parents standing, the space reorganizing itself from classroom to something more social. Eleanor stayed at her desk. She was not going to circulate and gather reactions. That was not what this was. Margaret came to her desk. She stood in front of it and said simply, "Well done." Then Eliza Dutton came, with Earl holding her hand, and said, "She's reading the labels on things at home, jars, signs. She reads them to me." She stopped. "I didn't expect—" She stopped again. She was afraid of letters before. She thought they were something you were born either having or not having. "They're not," Eleanor said. "I know that now." Eliza Dutton looked at Eleanor with a directness that had some weight behind it, the weight of a woman who was also acknowledging, without saying it, that she had signed a petition and had done it wrong and knew it. "What do you need? For the classroom? Supplies? Books? What do you need that you don't have?" Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "A proper arithmetic text. The one we have is missing the last 40 pages. "I'll have one sent from the city," Eliza said. "This week, child." Daniel Hollis was the last parent to leave. The other adults had filtered out over the following 20 minutes, most of them stopping briefly at Eleanor's desk with some version of what Eliza Dutton had said. Observation, acknowledgement, the particular quality of credit that people offer when they realize they've been slow and are trying to account for the lateness. Eleanor received each of these with the same measured directness she received everything, neither dismissing them nor making too much of them. Daniel stood by the door while the other parents were still present, and she could see him working himself toward something, and when the room finally emptied, he walked to her desk with his hat in his hands. "The standards Caroline's proposing," he said. Eleanor waited. "They're not right," he said. He said it like a man setting down something heavy. "I was at her house last Tuesday. She asked me to speak in support of them at the board meeting." He stopped. "I told her I would." Eleanor's expression did not change. "I'm not going to," he said. "I'm telling you because I told her I would, and I'm not going to, and I wanted to tell you so you'd know it wasn't— I wanted you to know." It was, she thought, one of the more awkward apologies she had ever received, which made it one of the more genuine. The polished ones were usually preparation. The awkward ones were usually real. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, with the relief of a man who has put something right and can now leave, and he left. Eleanor sat at her empty desk in the quiet room and looked at the chalkboard where the morning's lessons were still written and thought about what Caleb had said about Caroline doing her work in the street while Eleanor did hers in here. The street was not hers. She was not built for it, not the way Caroline was. The maneuvering, the petition, the carefully worded standards designed to make numbers tell a story, the children themselves contradicted. She could not match that on its own ground. But she had made the invisible visible today, and Daniel Hollis was going to change his vote, and Eliza Dutton was sending an arithmetic text from the city, and Emmett had read 6 sentences without stopping. The board meeting was Tuesday. She did not go to the board meeting. This was a decision she made on Saturday, and it surprised even her. She had been planning to attend, had prepared what she intended to say, had organized her documentation again, and thought through her argument. Then on Saturday morning, Emmett arrived for what they had both understood would be his last standalone session before he shifted fully into the regular class. And they worked for 2 hours on his reading, and something happened near the end of the session that changed her thinking. She had asked him to read from the natural history book, the same passage about migratory birds that Rose had read to the room on Thursday. She had used it deliberately because Emmett had heard Rose read it, and she wanted to see whether hearing it read well was useful to him. He read it, slowly, with effort, with the specific concentration of a person who is working and knows they are working. He got to the sentence that had stopped him in class, and this time he didn't wait for Eleanor's cue. He traced the letter on the page with his finger, set it under his breath, and kept going. He read all 3 paragraphs. When he finished, he set the book on the desk and looked at it and didn't say anything. Eleanor didn't say anything either. She had learned that some moments didn't need language around them. After a while, he said, "That's the hardest thing I've read." "Yes," she said. "Is it going to get easier?" She looked at him. She thought about the honest answer, which was, yes and no. Some things will get easier and some things will always require this from you. And the requiring is not the same as the failing, and the requiring is not the same as being less than. She thought about how to say that to a 12-year-old who had spent several years being told he didn't apply himself. "You'll get stronger," she said. "The road doesn't change. You change." He looked at the book again. "My dad came home from Thursday and said you were a good teacher." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I know he had some things to work through." "He works through stuff slow," Emmett said, with the matter-of-fact, unsentimental assessment of a child who knows his parent clearly. "But he gets there." Eleanor thought about the board meeting on Tuesday and about what it meant to fight for her place here versus what it meant to have already done what she came to do. Then she thought about something simpler. She had 12 students, and they were learning, and the board could look at the numbers all they wanted, but the numbers were not the point and never had been. What Caroline Mercer had been trying to do, from the beginning, was make the argument about something other than the children. Every time Eleanor showed up in a room to defend herself, she was accepting that frame. She was done accepting it. She sent a note to Gerald Pratt on Monday saying that she would not attend Tuesday's meeting, but that she had submitted her student progress documentation to his office and asked that it be read into the record. She told him she would be at the schoolhouse, teaching, if any board member wished to speak with her. She told Caleb that evening. I was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You sure?" "No," she said, "but I think it's right." He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her when she said something that surprised him, which was with the expression of a man who is reassessing a conclusion he'd already reached. "You're not worried they'll vote wrong without you there?" "They might vote wrong whether I'm there or not." She looked at her hands. "But I'm not going to spend another night sitting in a room while someone describes me as a problem. I've done that enough." He didn't push back. That was one of the things she had come to rely on about him. Not that he always agreed with her, but that when he didn't agree, he said so directly, and when he did, he didn't perform disagreement to seem balanced. "I'll be there," he said. "I know." "Is that all right?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." The board meeting was held on Tuesday evening. Eleanor lit the schoolhouse stove at 7 in the morning and taught her 12 students and came home to Margaret's and ate supper and sat with a book she wasn't reading and waited. Margaret came in at 8:30 with her coat still on and sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table. 3-2 against Caroline's standards, she said. Dutton voted with Pratt. Garrett voted with Caroline. I don't know why. Habit, I suppose. Hollis abstained. Eleanor set the book down. Hollis abstained? He didn't vote for you, but he didn't vote against you. At this point, I'll take it. Margaret poured herself coffee with the efficiency of a woman who has delivered news before and knows what to do with herself afterward. Caroline asked for a formal censure of the board for overriding community petition. Pratt tabled it. She left before the meeting closed. Eleanor sat with that. She's not finished, Eleanor said. No, Margaret agreed. She's not the kind of woman who's finished. But she lost 2 votes tonight, and 1 abstention from a man who was all the way in her camp 2 months ago. She looked at Eleanor steadily. That's not nothing. No, Eleanor said. It's not nothing. She went to bed at 9 o'clock. She lay in the dark in the small back room and thought about 12 children and a green book on a shelf and a burn scar on a man's left wrist, and the way the forge sounded in the morning, like something that had been there since before the town, since before anything, some deep, persistent working of metal into what it needed to be. She thought about staying. Not the decision she'd made when she burned the Pemberton letter. That had been a decision made in the abstract, about a future she was choosing. This was something different. This was the specific textured weight of a place that had become particular to her, the way places do when you've been in them long enough to accumulate experience that belongs nowhere else. The hinge on the schoolhouse door. Thomas reading page 4. The exact way the morning light came through the wavy schoolhouse glass and made the room look slightly fluid, like everything was in the process of becoming. She had not arrived in Raven Creek expecting to stay beyond a year. She had arrived expecting to teach 1 year, to build something in her documentation that she could carry to the next position, to survive. She was not thinking about the next position. That, she knew, was either the best sign she'd had or the most dangerous. She had not yet decided which. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep, which meant she'd thought about it more carefully than she'd intended. And when she woke in the morning, the first thing she heard was the sound of the forge starting up 2 streets over, the early hammer fall, steady and unhurried, shaping something out of what had been raw and resistant and formless into what it was going to be. She dressed and picked up her bag and walked to the schoolhouse. She had students waiting. Winter came to Raven Creek the way it came to most frontier towns, without asking and without apology. The first snow fell in early November, thin and dry, more suggestion than substance. But by the 3rd week it had settled in earnest, and the street outside the schoolhouse window went from dust-colored to white overnight and stayed that way. Eleanor had expected the cold to thin her enrollment. It was a pattern she'd seen before. Families who lived at a distance decided that the road wasn't worth the weather. Children were kept home to help with the additional labor that winter demanded, and classrooms that had been full in October became navigable by December. Instead, the opposite happened. 14 students by the 2nd week of November, 15 by the 3rd. A family named Casper had arrived in Raven Creek in late October. A father, a mother, and 3 children who ranged from 7 to 13, newly settled on a land claim east of the Hollis Ranch. The mother, a woman named Vera Casper, had come to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon, knocked, and asked directly whether her children could enroll. She did not mention Caroline Mercer's name or the petition or any of what had preceded Eleanor's position becoming permanent in anything but name. She simply said, "We heard you were good," and looked Eleanor in the eye when she said it, and Eleanor had said yes and written 3 more names in the register. The Casper children settled into the room with the adaptability of children accustomed to new places, and the class absorbed them with the ease of a group that had become, by this point, something Eleanor could accurately call a community. Thomas had taken the oldest, a boy named Will, under a provisional wing within the 1st week. Provisional in the way Thomas did everything, with a readiness to withdraw if the other party proved unworthy, which Will did not. Emmett had demonstrated for Will the letter tracing technique without being asked to, explaining it with the authority of someone who knew a thing from the inside, and Will had tried it and found it useful. And Emmett had watched this with an expression Eleanor recognized as pride that had nowhere comfortable to land yet. Rose had, quietly and without fanfare, become the child other children came to when they didn't understand something Eleanor had explained. Eleanor had noticed this first on a Tuesday. Pearl Dutton had been struggling with a passage, and Rose had leaned across from her desk and said something Eleanor didn't catch, and Pearl had read it again and gotten it. Eleanor had said nothing. She watched it happen twice more that week and still said nothing, because some things worked precisely because no adult had named them. The classroom was not a peaceful place in any soft sense of the word. It was loud in the way rooms with 15 children are always loud, with arguments and spilled ink and the particular drama of children who have spent enough time together to have established loyalties and disputes and elaborate hierarchies of expertise. Thomas and Will argued regularly about things that didn't matter. Emmett occasionally forgot that his interior voice was his interior voice. One of the Casper children, the middle one, had a habit of lying about her work that Eleanor addressed 3 separate times with decreasing patience. These were not problems that resolved themselves or wrapped up cleanly. They were the ongoing conditions of a room full of human beings learning how to be in proximity to each other. Eleanor managed them the way she managed everything, directly, without drama, with the baseline assumption that children were capable of more than they were currently demonstrating, and the job was to close the gap between the two. December arrived. 1. Caroline Mercer had been quiet since the board meeting. Not absent, Eleanor still saw her in the street, still crossed her path at the post office, still occasionally found herself in the feed store at the same time as Caroline was in the feed store, but quiet in the specific way of a person who is reassessing rather than retreating. Eleanor did not mistake the quiet for concession. She had known women like Caroline her whole life, and the quiet after a loss was often the most dangerous interval, the time when the next thing was being built. She was right, though the next thing turned out to be different from what she'd expected. On a Friday afternoon in the first week of December, Eleanor was closing up the schoolhouse when she heard boots on the boards outside and turned to find Caroline Mercer in the doorway, not hovering at the edge, not waiting to be acknowledged. Standing there with her coat buttoned to the collar and her hands at her sides, occupying the doorway the way she occupied every space, as though she'd measured it first. Eleanor looked at her. "Come in," she said. Caroline came in. She looked at the room, the 15 desks now, the books on the windowsill, the chalkboard with the week's last lesson still on it, a long division problem, and below it a geography question, and below that, in Rose's handwriting because Eleanor had asked her to write it for the younger students, a sentence from the migratory bird passage she'd read aloud in October. Caroline looked at all of this without comment, the way she did everything, with the attention of someone who intends to have an accurate picture. She sat down, without being invited to, in the chair Eleanor kept by the wall. Eleanor remained standing at her desk. "I want to tell you something," Caroline said. "And I want to be clear that I'm not here to apologize because I don't believe I was wrong about what I was trying to protect. I still believe, that a teacher is a representative figure and that standards matter." "They do," Eleanor said. Caroline looked at her sharply, as if she'd expected resistance and had prepared for it and was briefly disoriented without it. "What I did not account for," Caroline said, "was whether the standards I had in my head were actually the standards I claimed to be defending." She stopped. She looked at the sentence Rose had written on the board. "My granddaughter started reading this fall. She's 4. Her mother told me last week that she sounds out the labels on the jars in the kitchen and she's learning where all the letters go." She was quiet a moment. "She's learning from Pearl Dutton, apparently. They play together on Saturday afternoons. Pearl shows her." Eleanor did not say anything. "A child in this town is teaching my grandchild to read," Caroline said, "because she learned it here." She looked at Eleanor. The look was hard to read. Not warm, not soft, but something that had had its edges worn by something real. "That is not what I predicted would happen." "No," Eleanor said. "I expect not." Caroline stood. She adjusted her coat, the small, precise movement that was her physical signature. "I'm not going to be your supporter, Miss Whitaker. I want to be plain about that. I still think the board was hasty and the process was improper, but I am—" She stopped, started over. "I am revising my understanding of what the problem actually was." She walked to the door. She paused there without turning around, which Eleanor was beginning to recognize as the Raven Creek position for saying the difficult thing. "You were never the problem," Caroline said. It cost her something. Eleanor could hear it cost her something. "I thought you were. I was wrong about that." She left. Eleanor stood in the empty room for a long time after. She did not feel vindicated exactly. Vindication implied a kind of completion, a closing, and what she felt was more complicated than that. Something that acknowledged Caroline's words without being undone by them, that recognized the significance without placing more weight on it than it could hold. An intelligent woman who had been badly wrong had told her so. That was something. It was not everything. It was something. She picked up her bag and locked the door and walked home in the early dark and told Margaret, who said, "Well, better late than sensible," and poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked. The end of the first term came on the 3rd Friday of December. Eleanor had given each student a written assessment, not a test designed to produce grades for a board document, but an actual picture of where each child was versus where they had been. She wrote these herself, in her careful hand, 1 page per child, and she sent them home with the students on Thursday so that parents had a day to read them before she closed up for the winter break. The responses came in various forms. Eliza Dutton sent a note that said simply, "Thank you, she is a different child." Ada Hollis appeared at the door Friday morning before school started and stood there and said, "What Emmett wrote about the birds, I didn't know he could write like that." And Eleanor said, "He has things to say. He just needed a way to get them out. And Ada nodded with the contained intensity of a woman managing an emotion she hadn't scheduled. Even Daniel Hollis, who communicated primarily through absence of opposition rather than active support, had not been to the board, had not been to Caroline, had not done any of the things he might have done in October. Thomas came in on Friday morning and went directly to Eleanor's desk and put a piece of paper on it. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to Eleanor. He stood to the side of the desk while she read it, with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, performing indifference so thoroughly that it was its own form of exposure. The letter said, "Dear Miss Whitaker, I didn't think I could read this year. I don't mean I thought it was hard. I mean, I thought I was the kind of person who couldn't. I don't think that now. Thomas Warren." Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her desk drawer, in the place where she kept things she intended to keep. "Good letter," she said. Thomas shrugged. "It's just the truth." "Truth usually is good," Eleanor said. "Go sit down." He went, with the dignity of someone who has done something they're glad they did and doesn't need to discuss it further. Rose came in behind him and went to her desk and arranged her things, and then looked at Eleanor and said, "Are you coming back in January?" The room was still filling, children taking off coats, the noise level rising, and the question arrived in the middle of all of it with the directness that was Rose at her most unguarded. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'm coming back in January." Rose nodded, the single nod that was her way of filing a thing as settled. She took out her reading book and opened it to where she'd left off, which was something Rose had started doing, reading while she waited for the day to begin. Reading the way people eat when they're hungry, because they want what's in it. Eleanor watched her for a moment. 8 years old, a girl who had barely spoken when September started, reading a chapter book while she waited for school to begin, and teaching 4-year-olds on Saturday afternoons. She had not come to Raven Creek for Rose. She had not come for Thomas or Emmett or Pearl. She had come because she needed a position, and this was the one available, and someone named Gerald Pratt had signed a letter. What she had found, or what had found her, was something she hadn't planned and couldn't have planned because it was the kind of thing that only happened when you stayed somewhere long enough for it to accumulate. The last student left at noon on Friday, and Eleanor was cleaning the chalkboard when she heard the door. She turned, expecting Margaret. It was Caleb. He came in with snow on the shoulders of his coat from the walkover and stood in the center of the room, looking at the board, which was half erased, the week's lessons disappearing under the cloth in her hand. "Last day," he said. "For a few weeks," she said. He looked at the room the way he'd begun to look at it, as a place he knew, as a place that had become familiar to him through the accumulated days of collecting his children from it, and standing in its doorway, and, occasionally, repairing what needed repairing. He had fixed the window latch in November, and replaced a rotted floorboard near the back row without being asked, and without announcing it. She had simply arrived one morning to find it done. "I have something for you," he said. He said it with the particular discomfort of a man who is giving something and is not certain how it will be received, which was its own kind of information. He reached inside his coat and produced something small, wrapped in cloth. Eleanor set down the eraser and took it. It was a small iron figure, a bird, she realized, a few inches long, made with the careful craft of someone who worked in iron every day, but had applied that craft to something with no utilitarian purpose at all. The wings were slightly spread, as though the bird was in the moment before flight, and the detail in the feathers was precise in a way that required real time and real attention. It was not a simple thing. It was the work of someone who had made something because they wanted to make it for a specific person. She held it in both hands and looked at it. "Rose told me about the birds," he said. "The reading passage, the migratory ones. She talked about it for 3 days at dinner, apparently." He looked somewhere to the side of Eleanor. "I don't make things like that usually, just something I thought—" He stopped. "It's iron. It'll last." Eleanor looked at the bird in her hands and then at Caleb Warren, who had voted for her before anyone asked him to, and fixed her door without being asked, and spoken in front of a room full of people who watched him the way a town watches one of its own when he departs from expected behavior, and who was now standing in a schoolroom with snow on his coat, having made her a bird because his daughter talked about migratory patterns for 3 days. "It's beautiful," she said. She said it plainly, because it was plain. He looked at her then, the direct look. "I want to ask you something," he said. And you can tell me it's the wrong time or the wrong whatever. But I've been thinking about it a while, and I'm not good at not saying things once I've decided to say them. Eleanor waited. I don't want you to stay because this is the only place you've got, he said. You've got other places. That letter from Pemberton, and probably others you haven't told me about. You've got choices. He paused. What I want to know is whether you... He stopped, rearranged, the way he did when he was saying something that didn't come out right the first way. Whether Raven Creek is somewhere you're choosing or somewhere you're tolerating until something better turns up. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the snow was doing something soft and indifferent, falling at its own pace, covering the street in the slow, patient way that things accumulate when you're not watching. Eleanor thought about the Pemberton letter burning in the stove. She thought about Rose reading before school started because she wanted to know what was in the book. She thought about Thomas's letter in the drawer of her desk. She thought about the iron bird in her hands, which weighed more than something that small should, because iron was honest about itself. I burned the Pemberton letter in October, she said. I know, he said. I'm asking about now, about January and after January. She looked at him. I'm not tolerating this place, she said. I haven't been for a while. I don't know exactly when it changed, but it changed. She looked down at the bird. I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I'm staying because this is the specific place I want to be. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something in him settled, visibly, the way a thing settles when it's been braced against a wind that has stopped. All right, he said. He didn't make more of it than that. He didn't need to. I should finish the board, she said. Yeah. He didn't move. Eleanor? She looked up. I'm glad you didn't leave, he said. I've been glad since October, and I should have said it more plainly before now. She looked at him for a moment with the iron bird warm in her hands. She thought about all the ways a person could be seen, and all the ways a person could spend a life not being seen, and what it cost to stay in a place that required you to prove yourself at every turn, and what it meant when the proving was done, not because someone demanded it, but because the people there were worth doing it for. You said it plainly enough, she said. January came. She came back. The schoolroom was cold on the first morning because the stove had sat unlit for 2 weeks, and Eleanor arrived early to build it up before the children arrived, and she stood in the room while it warmed and looked at the 15 desks and thought about September, about standing in the street with her trunk at her feet while Caroline Mercer made herself plain, about how the room had smelled then of dust and disuse and other people's abandoned efforts. It did not smell that way now. It smelled of chalk and iron from the stove and the particular human warmth of a space that had been used regularly and with purpose. The iron bird sat on the corner of her desk. She had put it there on the first day back, after carrying it with her through the break, and she didn't explain it to anyone and nobody asked, because it was her desk and her room, and she didn't owe an explanation to anyone for what she chose to put on it. Thomas arrived first, which surprised her. He was usually exactly on time, with the punctuality of a child who has decided that early arrival shows too much. But he came through the door a full 10 minutes before school started, and stood in the room looking at the board where Eleanor had already written the first lesson of the new term. You changed the arrangement, he said. She had shifted the desk slightly, creating a small open space at the front for when she wanted children to gather rather than stay at their seats. It was a change she'd been considering since October. What do you think? She said. He looked at it. It's good. More room. He went to his desk. He took out his reading book, a different one now, longer, with smaller print, and opened it to his page. He didn't ask permission, he just read. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and watched him, and felt something that she didn't have a precise name for, something in the neighborhood of rightness, but less tidy than that word suggested. It was the feeling of being in the correct place at the correct time, doing the thing you were built to do, and it was not uncomplicated. There was work in it, and difficulty, and the knowledge that Caroline Mercer had not become her ally, and the board's continued support depended on continued outcomes, and the road ahead had no guarantee attached to it. But Thomas was reading before school started because he wanted to know what happened next. And Rose came in 5 minutes later and went to her desk and took out her letter-writing exercise without being reminded, and Emmett arrived with Will Casper, and they were already in the middle of an argument about something that had apparently been ongoing since before they'd left the street, an argument about the correct way to do something, and they brought it inside still talking, and Pearl came in behind them with her coat only half buttoned, and the other children filtered in over the next few minutes in ones and twos, and the room filled up with the sound of 15 children becoming present, and the stove clicked and the window light came through the wavy glass and made everything slightly fluid and alive. Eleanor picked up the chalk. This was what it actually looked like. Not a triumph with clean edges. Not a story that ended with everyone converted and every wrong made right and every person who had doubted her standing corrected and ashamed. Caroline Mercer would never be her advocate. Daniel Hollis had abstained. There were still families in Raven Creek who kept their children home because of what she looked like, who would always keep their children home, who had decided who she was before she'd spoken a word and would go to their graves having never revisited the decision. That was the real thing that nobody said about persisting through the judgment of other people. It didn't end. You didn't arrive at a moment where the last holdout came around and everyone finally agreed you deserved to be there. What happened instead, if you were fortunate and stubborn and willing to keep showing up, was something smaller and more durable than vindication. What happened was that the room filled up with children who expected to learn and expected you to help them, and the expectation itself became its own kind of answer to the question that had never stopped being asked. She had spent 34 years being evaluated on the basis of something that had nothing to do with who she was. She suspected she would spend the rest of her life being evaluated on the same basis, because that was how certain kinds of judgment worked. They didn't require evidence, and they didn't respond to refutation. They simply persisted as part of the atmosphere, and you learned either to be destroyed by the atmosphere or to breathe in spite of it. What she had learned, over years and with difficulty and not without cost, was that the only answer to being told you were not enough was to keep doing what you did well and let the doing accumulate. Not to prove anyone wrong, not to wait for the moment when proof became undeniable, just to keep doing it, day after day, because the work mattered, and the children in front of you mattered, and those were the things that were actually real. The rest was noise. She wrote the first word of the new lesson on the board. "Settle down," she said, and the room did, with the particular quality of a room that settles because it wants to, rather than because it's afraid. And 15 children picked up their pencils, and Eleanor Whitaker, the woman nobody in Raven Creek had wanted, began to teach Tom. By April, the school bell rang every morning at 8 o'clock, and the children of Raven Creek ran toward the sound. Thomas Warren finished his chapter book in March, and asked Eleanor for another, a longer one, without the casual performance this time. Just asked, directly, with the unguarded simplicity of a reader who has discovered that he is a reader and no longer needs to hide it. She gave him the frontier survival book she'd been saving since November, because she'd known it was coming. Emmett Hollis read aloud to the class on a Thursday in February, a full page chosen by him from the natural history book that had once been the measure of his limitation and was now just a book he liked. And when he finished, Will Casper said, "Read the next one," and Emmett did. Rose began bringing books home to read to her father in the evenings. Caleb mentioned this to Eleanor on a Saturday in March, standing outside the schoolhouse in the early spring air, with his coat open for the first time since October, with the expression of a man reporting a fact that still surprised him each time he encountered it. He said Rose had read 3 pages of the journal to him last week, Frances's journal, the green one from the shelf, and that she had stopped at certain sentences and asked him what they meant, and he had told her, and they had sat together for a long time with the book between them. He said it the way he said things that mattered to him, with the flatness that was not distance but its opposite, the voice of someone who has learned that the important things don't need amplification. Eleanor listened and did not fill the silence and did not make more of it than he intended. And in the first week of April, on a Tuesday morning with the sky just beginning to hold the warmth that signaled something turning, Eleanor arrived at the schoolhouse to find Caleb already there. He was standing outside the door, not fixing anything, not with tools in his hands, just standing there looking at the building the way a person looks at something they're trying to decide something about. She stopped beside him. "You're early," she said. "I wanted to talk to you before the children came," he said. He turned to look at her. He looked the way he'd looked in December when he'd brought the bird, that particular quality of a man who has made up his mind about something after a long time and is not going to be persuaded back from it. "I've been thinking about the spring," he said, "about what comes after the school year, about what you've said about staying." He paused. "I want to ask you properly. Not just whether you're staying for the school, whether you'd stay as part of this." He gestured at the building, at the street, and the gesture was imprecise in the way gestures are when the thing being pointed at is larger than any single object. Thomas and Rose need someone who's going to be here, and I... He stopped, and the stopping was its own sentence. I need that too. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about a woman in a dusty street in September with 40 pounds of books and a signed letter and a face that hadn't decided to cry because she'd taught herself not to. She thought about all the things she'd thought she would need to prove, and all the ways she had proved them, and how none of the proving had been the point, how the point had always been simpler and harder than proof, just the daily choice to stay in the room where you were needed, to open the door each morning regardless of what was written on the board, to teach the child in front of you what you had it in you to teach. She thought about the iron bird on the corner of her desk, which had lasted the winter. Yes, she said, simply, the way he said things. He looked at her for a long moment, and the look was the same one he'd given her the night she told him she'd burned the letter. The look of someone who has been hoping for something specific, and has been trying not to hope too precisely in case the precision made the wanting too visible. All right, he said. They stood together outside the schoolhouse in the early April light while Raven Creek woke up around them, and the forge 2 streets down started its first hammerfall of the morning, and somewhere down the road a child was already running toward the school bell that hadn't rung yet, just running toward where they expected it would be. Eleanor opened the door. It swung inward, quiet and easy on its hinge, and the morning light came in through the wavy glass and fell across 15 empty desks waiting to be filled. And she put her bag down and picked up the chalk and began to write, because the children were coming and there was work to do, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be,